Hello, my name is Harzing and I'm a professor, research mentor and staff development lead at Middlesex University London. Welcome to this presentation on improving your research profile, reputation and impact. This presentation consists of 8 sections that can be watched as freestanding videos or as part of a long playlist. So this is the 7 sessions in the 8-part series in which I will discuss a very simple 7-step process to improve your reputation and impact. Now, in the earlier presentations in this series we talked about research reputation, research impact, as well as various topics related to citation impact. If you are interested in these and haven't watched them yet, make sure you catch up with them at some stage. In the previous session, we discussed the importance of setting up research profiles and the pros and cons of social media. And I gave you a really quick overview of the various social media options. Now, in this session, we'll get very practical. I'll talk you through the process that I do follow myself for every single paper that I publish. Obviously, publicizing an individual paper is only part of improving your reputation and impact, but for most of us, publications are a very important and tangible part of our research. So I focused on something that will be important for most of the audience. And 7 steps might sound like quite a lot, but many of the steps are really quick to do. Now, here's the whole 7-step process. You can find details in a blog post I've written about this, how to ensure your paper achieves the impact it deserves. Although some of these steps are probably more relevant to academic impact as measured by citations, the steps related to sharing the news about your paper on social media can certainly be a way to facilitate non-academic impact too. So the first 4 steps in light blue are all about making your paper available online to ensure it can be found by people who want to find it. The next 3 steps in darker blue are all related to communicating about your paper to increase the likelihood that people will find your paper. Again, please don't see this as a straitjacket. If it makes more sense to you to do this in a different order, just go ahead. The main thing is to do as many as possible of these. And as there are a lot of steps, I will take you through them one by one. Now, the first thing to do, as soon as you have your paper accepted for a journal, you create a pre-publication version. So what's that, a pre-publication version? Well, it's basically the paper that was accepted for the journal, but not in the journal formatting. It's your own formatting. Now, nearly all publishers allow you to share this pre-publication version on the various social media. I would say probably about 90%. Even though it's a pre-publication version and it's not a nice journal formatting, it doesn't mean that you have to submit the same manuscript that you submitted to the journal. That tends to be double-spaced with white margins, with all of the tables and features at the end. It doesn't look very attractive, nor is it easy to read, at least not to me. So what I usually do is I just take the paper and change it from double space to 1.5 space, so single space. I make sure that there's a neat heading structure that I like, not the one that the journal requires, and I put all the tables and figures at the end, within the paper, so that people can actually look at them whilst they are reading it. You can do any other things that you think would make the paper look more pretty, something just you could be proud of, even though it doesn't have the journal formatting. So what I then do is I put it on my website, and I show you how that looks on the next slide. I just put all my papers there, so whenever I have a paper accepted, I just put the abstract there and a link to the paper itself. Then once it's published, I also add the publication details. So whenever someone wants to download any of my papers, they can just go to this list and get the papers. Now, some of you might have your own website, for instance on Google Sites, where you can also do this. If you don't have your own website, then it's just a matter of doing your pre-publication version. Now, here are 2 examples of pre-publication versions that I prepared for 2 recently accepted papers. I also listed the blog posts that my co-authors wrote for these papers, and these blog posts were posted on my website, but in the first case also in the journal's blog post series. As you can see, the layout is a bit nicer than what you would normally submit to a journal. At the right hand side you can also see part of my list of online papers on my own website, and as you can see it's just a list of abstracts with links to downloads for the paper and links to find the full publication details. Now some of you will have your own website, for instance on the Google Sites, where you could do this, but you could also do something similar on your university staff profile or on LinkedIn. But for most of you though, doing this on ResearchGate, which we will discuss later, might be an easier solution. What most of you will need to do as the very first step after you've done a pre-publication version is to put the paper in your university's paper repository. In the UK, this needs to be done within 3 months of acceptance, not publication. Acceptance. It's compulsory. If you don't do it, it doesn't count for the ref, so your university is losing out in terms of both ref ranking and in terms of research funding, so you will lose out in the end as well. So make sure you do that. So whenever you have a paper accepted, the first thing you do is upload it in your university repository. We had a discussion about this last week in one of the research lunches that I'm running, and I said, well, celebrate, open a bottle of champagne or do something else that makes you happy, and then the next day put the paper on the university repository. And then one of the research leads said, well, put the paper on the repository first and then celebrate, because you might forget the next day, especially if you had too much champagne. So I think that's very good advice. Now the next step is updating your key researcher profiles. Remember, we talked about 3 of them being crucial in the previous session of this presentation: your staff profile, your Google Scholar profile and your ORCID profile. Most staff profiles have automatic links to your university's repository, so there's no need to do anything there. The great thing about most of these repositories is that they're also covered by Google Scholar. The Middlesex repository certainly is. So Google Scholar usually picks up new additions to repositories within a few days, certainly within a week. So once your paper is in a university repository, everyone can find it on Google Scholar. This is particularly important for book chapters that are usually quite difficult to find in other ways, and I'll show you how this works on the next slide. You can also update your ORCID profile at this stage, but ORCID can be a bit slower to find your paper online, so you might need to enter it manually. If that's the case, you might want to wait a few more weeks until ORCID discovers it automatically and you don't need to manually enter it. Now, just to give you an example, here are 2 book chapters I published recently with my 2 former PhD students in an edited book on intercultural management in practice. I included these 2 book chapters with a pre-publication version of the text in the Middlesex repository. As you can see, they were captured by Google Scholar, and you will see an indication in the top right hand indicating that a PDF of the chapter can be found in the Middlesex repository. It only took a few days for them to appear on Google Scholar. If you have a Google Scholar profile, Google Scholar will then even send you an email saying they have found a new paper for you. So I then added these to my Google Scholar profile, and as you can see, this lists the full abstract so that people can read the abstract. The hyperlink title then leads to the publisher's version of the chapter, in this case Emerald Publishing. So anyone working at a university with a subscription to Emerald's books can also read the full publisher's version online. I've set my Google Scholar profile preference to manual editions and just approve the edition after I receive a Google Scholar email. This takes a little bit more time than having Google Scholar add new papers automatically, but even so, it only takes 2 or 3 minutes. If you do let Google Scholar add papers automatically, you run the risk that they add papers that are not yours, but written by someone else with the same name, or that they add things you really don't want on your official profile, like PowerPoint presentations that they might have found on an academic website. I've included links to 2 blog posts that can help you to make the most of your Google Scholar profile. This material is a bit more advanced, but it's still quite easy to do, and I highly recommend it for those who are serious about building up a comprehensive online academic identity. Now, Step 4 has a bit more of a social media flavor as it involves potential interaction with others. So this is putting your paper not just in your own university repository where the amount of engagement with others might be a bit limited, but also put it in a public repository. As I discussed in the 6th part of this presentation, there are a lot of public repositories out there. There are general repositories such as SSRN, and these have existed for 20 to 25 years, some even 30 years, and they have been used mostly by scientists and life scientists, but REPEC, for instance, is very popular with economists. So talk to your colleagues and figure out what they are using, because it doesn't make sense to use a repository that nobody else in your discipline uses, because they're not going to look at it and they're not going to find your paper there. This will only take you 3 to 5 minutes. In recent years, about 10 years ago, a different kind of repositories emerged that are more like social media platforms like ResearchGate or academia.edu. I don't have a lot of experience with the academia.edu, but for ResearchGate the process is very simple. ResearchGate usually discovers your paper online, and then when you log in, it will have a recommendation to add that paper, and you can do that with just a few clicks. Depending on your settings, you might even get an email reminder doing this, and then all you need to do is add the full text version, so the pre-publication version that you prepared in step 1. So here are a few examples of public repositories. First, Archive, where one of my co-authors in computer science regularly adds their papers. Second, SSRN, where many of our economist colleagues at Middlesex publish their papers. Here are a few papers by Praveen Kujal, the head of our economics department. And then, as I said, there are 2 more recent repositories that look a bit more flash and have lots more opportunities for interaction. First, academia.edu, which is used by quite a lot of academics in the humanities. So here's a profile of my colleague Nico Pizzolato, who is a historian. And then finally, ResearchGate, which is used a lot in the sciences and life sciences, but increasingly in other disciplines too. So I've decided to give up my academia.edu account and focus on ResearchGate. As you can see, it clearly indicates whether papers are available in full text, and for some papers it also picks up the figures and tables and displays them. This might draw more people to the papers. And remember that Google Scholar will normally find papers in these repositories too. So once your papers are in these repositories, they will get a broader exposure through Google Scholar too. There's a lot more you can do with ResearchGate. You can create projects, submit questions, answer other people's questions, check out your statistics for the number of reads or citations. So if you're interested in this, I suggest you have a look at my separate blog post on this, which is linked on this slide. Now, the first 4 steps are all about doing all you can to make your paper accessible to the broadest possible audience. Remember, if you don't do this, only people who work in well-resourced universities that are rich enough to have lots of journal subscriptions and libraries that buy lots of books can access your work. So the next step after you've made your paper available is to start communicating about your paper. So what I normally do is I just write up a really short blog post about a new paper. Not one where you take a day or 2 to write up a post, but just one that might take you an hour or less. So what I do is I just write a few lines to introduce the paper, put a full reference there, put the abstract there, and that's it. Once this is ready, I share it through social media, and I use mainly Twitter and LinkedIn, but you can share it on any other platform too. Now, if you don't have your own website or blog, which most of you will not have, then a perfectly good alternative is LinkedIn. And you can post updates about your own work there, either through short posts or through full-blown articles. And I think it's a really good way to start distributing your work. And if you really don't want to go through the efforts of writing up something, you can just take a screenshot of the abstract, share that on Twitter or LinkedIn. That's literally just 20 seconds. Remember though that people generally do respond better if you ask a few personal lines about the paper in lay terms. So here's an example for an article that was accepted quite recently. It was first authored by my former PhD student, Harzing. And I wrote up a short blog post about this, introducing Shay's work with links to other posts about her articles, and told a bit about our positive experience with the journal in which the article was published. Then I chose an evocative image to go with the post, and making sure obviously it's copyright free, and you're all ready to go. I then shared this on LinkedIn with the sharing button on my own website. And if you don't have your own website, you can just write this directly on LinkedIn. If you'd like to know more about doing this on LinkedIn, just read my blog post on this. And then Shay tweeted about this, and if you look closely, you can see that she also included a separate link to ResearchGate, so people could immediately download the pre-publication version as well, which was a great idea. And remember that you can share your paper multiple times. I wouldn't recommend you to do it several times a week, but it's perfectly fine just to share it maybe half a dozen times a year. And remember that people are not glued to social media. Well, I hope not, at least. So any single communication will only reach a small number of people. Now, this might seem a lot of work, but in many disciplines, and certainly in the social sciences and humanities, academics only publish 1 or 2 articles a year, so it really isn't that time consuming. And as we talked about in session 3 of this presentation, in the life sciences and sciences, academics might publish many more and shorter papers, so it would be a bit more work, but in that case they also have more co-authors, so you can spread the work between them. Now, step 6 in the process is something that might seem a little bit of an old-fashioned way of communicating, especially to many younger academics, sending a personal email. But it's still an important means of communication for many in my generation who only encountered emails in their late 20s, let alone for those who are older. And many academics in this age group will not be heavy users of social media, so they might not see any of your messages on these platforms. And yet, these senior academics might be exactly the people you want to know about your paper. So using email can be really effective in ensuring the right people know about your paper. You might have published a paper and think, oh, it would be great if that person would actually read my work, because I've drawn on their work in my own research. I've met this person at a number of conferences. But you can't be sure that they would pick up the article if you didn't point it out to them. Or they might pick it up, but they might only pick it up in a year's time, when it appears in print, rather than right now. So what I do is I keep all my papers in a folder in my computer. So if anyone sends me an email saying I'm interested in a particular paper, it takes me literally less than a minute to send the response back. It's not like, oh my god, where do I have this paper? I can't find it anymore. Oh, maybe I'll let it go. It's not that important. No, it just takes me a minute to just thank them for their interest in my work. If it's someone I know well or like to engage with, of course I write a slightly longer email, but otherwise it's just thank you for your interest in my work. Here is a copy of the paper. However, you can also do this proactively, and as a junior academic, this is a really good way to start building your network. You've cited a lot of these academics in your paper, you're building on their work, so you would want them to know about your work. But at the same time, you don't want to be obnoxious. Don't send one and the same email to a whole group of people all in BCC. So don't do mass mailing. It's email clutter at best and spamming at worst, and it won't build you a positive academic identity. And if you do send an email, make it a nice email. So it's not like, okay, here's my work, go and read it. It's a nice introduction, like, you might not remember me, but this is where we met, and this is where I think you might be interested. So I'll give you a few examples of this on the next slide. You can also find a bit more information in the blog post that I've listed on this slide. So here are some examples of what I think are effective email communications. The first example is an email I received quite a while ago now from a PhD student whom I met when I gave a presentation at Victoria University in New Zealand. And she had now finished her PhD, published a couple of articles, but she also had a doodle created about her research. Now, you might not know what a doodle is, I didn't, but it's a video with live hand-drawn animations which build up a story about your research. And I thought it was a really neat way to summarize the key messages of the paper in a way that you can engage more people with than by just sending them the article. So her email was really effective because she explained what a doodle was in the email, and I was really keen to have a look because this was something new for me as well. As you can see, the doodle has more than 2,500 views, so it created quite a bit of exposure for her paper. What she also did was include a picture of herself, which of course I normally don't expect people to do, but in this case, because it had been about 7 or 8 years since I saw her, it was quite useful. Another one which I received a few years ago, was written by someone who had written an article that cited my work in the Academy of Management Learning and Education. And it was about a related topic, a paper on socializing doctoral students into the research profession. And she shared that with me, but she also said that maybe the Sick Now Women's Network, of which she is also a member, might be interested in it as well. And I think that's a really nice way of sharing your work because you identify why the person might be interested in it. So these emails are not just about, here's my work, they are carefully thinking about useful ways in which you can do it. If you're hesitant about how to address academics by email, this blog post linked on the slide might be useful too. Now, step 7 is probably the most time-consuming step of the whole process, and that's to write a blog post about your paper. And blogging is something you can do on pretty much any topic. I do a lot of blogging on my own website, on academic skills, publish or perish, academic etiquette, and the Sick Now Women's Network. But I also write about my own research, and most academics tend to write mostly about their own research if they're blogging. So you can write a blog post about an individual article, and I'll give you a few examples of that on the next slide. But you can also, and that's often more useful, write up a blog post about a number of articles combined, because you don't generally generate impacts, whether academic or societal impact, by doing one article on a particular topic. You create impact by having a research stream on a particular topic. And I'll give you a few examples of that on the next slide too. So there are a lot of different outlets for blog posts. You can open your own blog. There are plenty of platforms out there that allow you to do this, as WordPress or Blogger, but that's a big commitment. You can also start small by posting on, for instance, Medium, which is a collective blogging platform where you have your own corner. But for all of these, you might see your contributions drown in a sea of lifestyle blogs. So if you don't have an established academic profile yet, you're much better off writing for an established academic blog. I would first of all suggest Middlesex Minds, the Middlesex University blog. I've published 4 blog posts there, and many colleagues have done the same. So this benefits both you and the university. If you work in the social sciences, you can also try the LSE blogs. LSE has no less than 60 different blogs, including LSE Business Review, British and European Politics and Policy, Behavioral Science, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, Social Policy, International Development. There are zillions of them. There are quite a lot of Middlesex colleagues who have blogged there, and I've included a link to some of their posts. Some of my own posts on my own blog were reprinted on the LSE Impact in the Social Sciences blog. Another option is The Conversation, which posts news stories and commentaries that are based on research. It's very well respected, and increasingly journalists go there for accessible summaries to research, which they then write up in a more traditional newspaper. So it creates a multiplier effect. It's quite hard though to get accepted there these days, so if you do want to try it, I suggest you reach out to colleagues who've published there before. Again, I've included a link on this slide to Middlesex authors on this blog. And if you do find it too hard to get accepted on these external blogs because your research doesn't quite fit, you can also simply write up an article on LinkedIn. And doing a series of these will allow you to build up a public profile here, and I will show you some examples of that too. And then finally, if you want to know even more about blogging, I suggest you read the blog post that I've listed on this slide. So here are a few examples of blog posts on single articles on my blog. They were all written as guest posts by my co-authors or Cigna members. I also have quite a lot of posts on my website on research streams. For instance, I've done quite a bit of work on response styles in international mail surveys. So if you send out a questionnaire across different countries and you ask people to respond on a Likert scale of 1 to 7, in some countries, regardless of what the question is, they will pretty much always pick 5 or 6. In other countries, regardless of what the question is, they might always lean towards the middle or go to one of the extremes. This makes it really hard to do research internationally because you don't know whether they actually agree or disagree with the statement or whether they just agree or disagree with anything. So given that I am an international business scholar and this was not something that was generally recognized in my field, I did quite a bit of research on this. So I wrote up all the studies, and I also refer to some useful methodological articles in international business. So altogether, the post would be something that people can draw on if they do research on international business. Then, as responses also differ depending on whether the questionnaires are distributed in someone's native language or in English, I had another stream of research on that, which I also wrote up as a blog post. Then I've also done a lot of research on rankings, journal rankings, university rankings, rankings of individual academics, but also on the data sources and metrics used on these rankings. So again, I wrote up a blog post summarizing 9 articles on this topic. And doing a post like this works really well if you're not just wanting to share your research, but also do further research on the topic. Now, one of my co-authors, Helene Tenzer, works on multilingual teams, and she's published a couple of articles for different elements of multilingual teamwork, and has briefly summarized each of them and has used this blog post to go to companies. And all of her work is interview based, so to be able to go to companies and to say, this is the work I've been doing, is quite useful. They're much more likely to read a blog post than her academic articles, and with this she can give a quick introduction about her research, and they can see she's actually done quite a few things in the area, and thus they're more likely to let her in and give her a chance to interview her for the next project. Now, on the previous slide, I showed you some examples of blog posts on my own website. Here are some blog posts on other blogs. First of all, MDX Minds, which is the Middlesex University blogging platform. A lot of Middlesex University academics have blogged on this. Then LSE blogs. As I mentioned, there are about 60 different ones. I have posted about half a dozen times on the LSE Impact blog, with articles related to academic impact and academia more widely. Most of these were repostings from my own blog, but one of them was specifically written for the LSE blog. Then I mentioned The Conversation. We have about a dozen academics who've published there, and here is an example from one of our colleagues in ACI. Finally, I mentioned LinkedIn. My business school colleague, Nico Pizzolato, has published about a dozen articles on topics related to academic writing and research skills, which fit very well with his role as director of doctorate programs. Now, I really hope you enjoyed this part of the presentation and you've picked up some tips about what specifically you can do to improve the chances that your research papers get the impact they deserved. And please don't feel you have to do all of this. Personally, it's taken me years to get familiar with all of these platforms. And again, this is just a menu of options. Just do whatever appeals to you initially and then build on from there. So in the next and final session, I will give you some evidence showing that sharing your work on social media is effective. And I will provide you with some guidelines on how to get started on improving your research profile and reputation if you really have very little time. If you are watching this presentation from outside Middlesex University, I wish you all the best in building your research profile, reputation and impact. If you're watching this in preparation for a flipped classroom session at Middlesex University, I really look forward to seeing you in one of those sessions. But do make sure you come prepared with your questions.